Greg Shumack, Senior TCB Reviewer, is a veteran of the wireless regulatory industry, serving for a dozen years at the Equipment Authorization Branch at the Federal Communications Commission. Greg has reviewed thousands of devices for compliance with the FCC and ICIT Canada rules and is on the board of directors of the Telecommunication Certification Body Council, TCBC. Greg has given lectures, sermons, and presentations for a variety of audiences and continues to tackle complex device applications. So, without further ado, let's turn our attention to wireless modular certification for North America, IoT, and other applications with Greg Shumack. Hi, Greg.
How are you doing today, Kim?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great. It's all yours.
All right. Let me begin to share my screen. Okay, and as Kim said, we're going to be talking this afternoon about transmitter module certifications here in North America. Most of the requirements, or many of the requirements between America and Canada are very similar, and so we'll be talking about those, and I'll also talk about some of the differences as well. Just a brief background, as Kim mentioned, I've been in this business for a very long time. I've been doing equipment authorizations for more than 30 years. I started out of college back in '87 at the equipment at the FCC and then went to the FCC laboratory and worked in equipment authorization there for 11 or 12 years. Then at the beginning of the TCB program, when the TCB program was introduced in 2000, I left the FCC at that time, and I've worked for a couple of TCBs since then. And for the last more than 5 years now, I have been a reviewer here at American Certification Body. So we're going to be talking about modules this afternoon, and the information I'm going to be providing is pretty general about modules. It's going to be discussing the requirements both for the module manufacturer or grantee, as well as some of the requirements for the host manufacturers who are buying and using the modules, installers, and the like. In a 1-hour presentation, of course, it has to be a pretty high view of the whole situation. We're not going to be able to dig into too many deep details. And certainly, if you have questions, I ask that you please make it a point to ask them. I think we'll be addressing questions at the end of the presentation, and then I'll provide you with contact information for myself as well, and feel free to email me any additional questions that you might have about anything that we're talking about in today's presentation. So modules. Modules are more popular than ever, and I did a little bit of research the other day and came up with these numbers here that you see. This is looking at 2.4 gigahertz modules that are generally Bluetooth or Bluetooth LE. There could be a few other technologies in there. ANT Plus is an example that springs to mind for that might take up for some of these. But I think the point is that you can see how 15 years ago in 2005, there were only 24 modules for 2.4 gigahertz Bluetooth type modules certified in the entire year. That's everywhere by all TCBs. That jumped up, almost tripled in 2010 to 68, and then the big jump by 2015 over 1,400, and last year in 2019 over 2,100 modules were certified for use and for sale here in the United States, and this is just the United States, not including Canada. So you can certainly see the explosion in the popularity of modules. And there's a couple of very good reasons for that, and we'll be talking about that. But the primary one is right here, that non-module manufacturers, or non-radio manufacturers rather, can take advantage of state-of-the-art communications in their products through the use of these modules. And certainly the IoT is going to be relying heavily upon them. In general, everywhere you look, it's a wireless world. There are entrepreneurs everywhere, people who are thinking of new and innovative ways to use wireless communications and to make their products, which perhaps had never had any thought of wireless communications before, suddenly they're wireless and they're connected. And you know, the examples that come up all the time are things like your washing machine in your home, or the flower pot that you have that now has a little Bluetooth module connected to it, so it tells your smartphone when the soil is dry in the flower pot and it's time for you to water it again. All of these things, both the whole Internet of Things and also a lot of the machine-to-machine type communications and networks that we see out there, these are things that we all want to take advantage of. The problem is a lot of the people who make these other things are not experts in radio requirements, and they don't understand what it takes to get their devices approved, or to approve devices for that matter, that are transmitters and receivers. And so, of course, people like that look to the market for modules out there. This is one of the reasons that modules were created. You can buy a module, integrate it into your host, and you're good to go. And it sounds very easy, and indeed it's not extremely difficult, but there are certain situations that can make it rather complex. And over the years, a lot of people have struggled to understand the real requirements and what is still required of you when you're using a module, and exactly what that module's authorization entails. A lot of those questions come up in the minds of manufacturers of both modules and hosts. Unfortunately, we see a lot of those questions and mistakes coming out of certain test labs and even some TCBs. So it's not something that's an easy thing to tackle in all situations, and there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. So we'll start out focusing, as I said, here on the United States. We've had modular approvals under the FCC since about 96 or 97, as I recall. The intent and the original intent of modules, and the intent of modules has always been to provide relief from the authorization burden that's placed upon manufacturers when they have a radio in their device. FCC rules require that that radio be certified. In order to relieve that burden of certification from the flower pot manufacturer, who simply wants to be able to connect his flower pot to somebody's app on a smartphone, the use of modules is an ideal thing to use in that situation, because it will not require that the flower pot manufacturer perform a new certification on his flower pot just because he's included that Bluetooth transmitter. However, the intent of modular authorization has never been to provide relief from the necessary testing that's required whenever you place a module into a new host device. And a lot of people have misunderstood that over the years. A lot of host manufacturers particularly have thought that if they bought a certified module, they could plug it into their device and not have to do anything further and were free to use it. And that's really not true. Anytime you buy a module and you put it into your device, there is a requirement that some testing be performed. Now, that testing is a subset of what would need to be done if you were actually seeking authorization for the radio, if you're trying to get it certified. So if you're using a module that's already been certified and had the full gamut of tests run upon it, then when you install it into your flower pot or whatever your gizmo might be, then there's a subset of tests that you must have performed that will demonstrate that the radio continues to comply even when installed in your product. The difference is that you do not have to submit these tests to the TCB or to the FCC, and you do not have to reapprove your device. You simply have to keep that data on file for yourself, because if there's ever a complaint of interference that's being caused by your flower pot, then the FCC is going to come to you and ask to see what proof you have that the module continues to comply in the flower pot. At that point, you would be called upon to be able to produce at least the spot check test data, which was sufficient to give you confidence that the radio should be compliant when installed in your device. There are a couple of different types of modular approval. The basic type is referred to as a full modular approval. This is when the radio module has been approved for use in any type of host device under any circumstance, or nearly any circumstance. Any type of environment, only keeping to the specific parameters of the radio as specified on the grant of authorization. This is typically known as a full or single modular approval, or an FMA. A lot of times people will simply refer to this as the modular approval, MA. For example, in Canada, they simply refer to it as the modular approval version, MA. The other version is the limited modular approval. And this is typically a module that's been approved for a specific host or a specific environment, and oftentimes it is installed under the control of the module's grantee. Oftentimes the manufacturer, but not necessarily. The grantee is the person who, in the FCC's eyes, is legally responsible for the compliance of the module. So in this particular case, the module, the radio, still has to comply with all of the FCC rules pertaining to the band in which it operates, the frequency tolerance, the occupied bandwidth, the output power, the spurious levels. Those types of things must all completely comply. But the specific modular approval requirements, and we'll be talking about those shortly, if you do not comply with one or more of those, then you can obtain a limited modular approval. And the grant of authorization would then define what that limitation is. And typically it means that one of the requirements, one or more of the requirements, as I said, could not be met. And for example, one of those requirements is voltage regulation to the input of the module. The module must have its own voltage regulation. Some modules do not have that, but the module manufacturer might say, but we have complete control. We're only going to be installing this in our own host devices, and we always control the voltage level going in. Nobody has the option to do that. And so that would be an example of a limited modular approval where that module, that limited module, is approved for use specifically when installed in the module manufacturer's own host devices. And so the authorization is limited to those specific scenarios, and that would be an example then of a requirement for a limited modular approval. So in either event, whether it's a full modular approval or a limited modular approval, there are many requirements that are similar that cannot be avoided. One of them is the module must have its own ID number. It must be labeled with that FCC ID number. And then any host into which that module is installed, regardless of the fact whether it's a full module or a limited module, any host into which that module is installed must bear a label on its exterior that identifies the fact that it contains a transmitter module. And the typical text is printed there in the example, contains TX or transmitter FCC ID, and that's the ID number of the module itself. This is a requirement for all host manufacturers to label the outside of their host device identifying the transmitter module by its FCC ID that's been installed in there. Please note that this ID number is only for the module. It is not in any way, the host does not also obtain this ID number just by virtue of the fact that it has the module installed in it. That ID number is still specifically for the module and not for the host device. These modular approvals and requirements are defined in Part 15 for unlicensed devices, unlicensed transmitters, as well as unintentional radiators, in Section 15.212. Now, licensed transmitters go under different parts of the rules. That might be GSM, wide CDMA, LTE, things of that nature. Those devices may also be certified as modules, and they would basically follow the same requirements specified in 15.212. However, due in large part to the way that the FCC rules are constructed, the licensed services are spread out over a couple of dozen different rule parts. And so it would be extremely tedious and cumbersome given the way the law is written and the way that the FCC has to take its time and go through comments and reply comments in order to make any changes to the rules. To make a general sweeping change like this for licensed transmitters would be extremely difficult. And so instead, the FCC permits it by policy. And the policy is that other than one or two specific points, the licensed transmitter module must meet the same requirements that are specified for the unlicensed transmitter module, again, with one or two specific exceptions. So you have to realize that there are technical, administrative, testing, and certification requirements that are required when you're applying for a modular approval for your device if you are a module manufacturer. There's a set of criteria for module certifications, which allow the module to obtain a full module approval and be used in any type of device. If you meet all of these criteria, then you can obtain authorization as a full modular approval. If you do not meet all of the criteria, you cannot obtain full modular approval for your device. And these are the specific certification criteria for modular approval. 8 of them, and I'll just run through them quickly. Number 1, the transmitter section must have its own shield. This is an RF shield over the transmitter circuitry of the module. Note that the reason for this shield is not only to allow it to more easily pass spurious emission requirements. A lot of people will say, well, I can pass spurious emission even without a shield. Do I still need to use the shield? The answer is yes, you do. You must have a shield on there because the purpose of the shield is not only to keep spurious emissions down, but perhaps equally or even more importantly, it is to protect the transmit circuitry from being adversely affected by strong fields existing in the host device into which it might be installed. And if there are very powerful electric or magnetic fields going on in a particular host device that potentially pull that circuitry out, for example, causing the frequency to drift or something along that nature, that would be a problem. And so that shield is both to keep spurious emissions down from the transmitter of the module transmitter, but also to protect that module to ensure that its operation is not adversely affected by the environment in which it's been installed. Second requirement, must have buffered modulation and data inputs. This is a pretty standard thing that most data type devices are going to have some type of buffering on them in any event. So a lot of times this is actually even nowadays built into the chips themselves. To be honest, this requirement really came about originally because back in the 90s, we were seeing a lot of modules that were FM transmitters, straight FM voice transmitters. And if you don't have any type of modulation limiting on that, then the louder the input, if you start shouting into the microphone, it's going to cause the deviation to exceed the 200 kilohertz requirement for those types of devices. And so there has to be buffered modulation. It's less important now with a lot of the digital communications, but we still also see some analog modules, and so this is still an important requirement to keep in mind. Number 3, the power supply regulation. Again, we want to make sure that if the power supply being provided to the module by the host exceeds what the module normally would operate at, that it's not going to cause the module to react in a way that causes emissions to occur that are outside of its authorized parameters. And so the module must have that type of power supply regulation to ensure that the power it's applying to its device is within its expected limitations. Number 4, must meet the antenna connector requirements. This is one of those, for example, as an aside, that would not be required for a licensed module. But for an unlicensed module, it must meet the antenna requirements. That's in section 15.203, I believe, and somewhat in 204 now as well, more for antennas. Typically, modules will have trace antennas on the board, so this is a non-issue. But many times they will provide a small connector there as well. It cannot be a standard connector, and the FCC over the years has pretty much knuckled under to pressure from the industry, if you will, and maintained the requirement only for SMA, BNC, and N-type connectors for the most part. So if you're using other types of less common connectors on there, that is now acceptable and is considered quote-unquote unique or uncommon. Requirement number 5, must be tested in a standalone configuration. This means particularly when you're doing radiated emission testing on the module, it has to be sitting there on the test table in a standalone configuration. It cannot be installed into any kind of case that might offer some shielding to it. You have to demonstrate, in order to get full modular approval, you must demonstrate that the module does not have to rely on the host in order to comply with spurious emission requirements. So the host might be a plastic box, which would not provide any help in that regard. And so the module must be sitting there by itself on the table, or perhaps attached to a test board of some sort, and that's okay. But there can't be any shielding or any covering over the module itself. It must comply with all of the spurious emission requirements in that standalone configuration. The module must be labeled with the FCC ID number. This is typically a label that's placed like on the chip. You must show that ID number, if nothing else. Must meet its own specific rules and requirements, and this has to do with, for example, if you're getting a Bluetooth module or a Bluetooth LE module that has to comply with the 15.247 requirements. All of those 15.247 requirements must be met for that operation. That's apart from these specific modular requirements. And then finally, number 8, must meet RF exposure requirements. Most modules, the vast majority of modules, are initially approved as mobile devices with respect to RF exposure compliance, though some are then later authorized for use in portable situations, portable environments. And we're going to talk about that in some detail in a few minutes. So, as I noted, you have to comply with all of these different requirements here, and then you have to, in your application, if you're applying for the certification of the module to a TCB, you have to include in your application an attestation letter that lists all the requirements and attests to the fact that you do indeed comply with all of them. And I noted here at the bottom, you can't exclude any of them if you wish to obtain that full modular approval. And some of the things that we hear, on a regular basis, we pass even without the shield, and we talked about that already. Or it only operates when it's inside the host. It can't operate standalone. Or, well, hosts always use that same power supply, so we don't really have to regulate our voltage. A lot of different situations like that come up, a lot of questions like that come up from module manufacturers, and the answer is always the same. It doesn't matter. You have to comply with all 8 of those criteria if you wish to obtain full modular approval for the device. And none of these other issues matter. If you can't comply with any of these other specific things, then you would have to then obtain a limited modular approval where you can demonstrate that through control over the installation, you will always ensure that all 8 of those criteria are still being met. One of the requirements that every module manufacturer must provide, whether it's a full module or a limited module, is they must provide clear installation and usage instructions to the installer. And they have to be as detailed as are necessary for the requirements of that specific module. You must instruct the installer on the conditions of use, where the module is permitted to be used, where the module may not be permitted to be used. The manufacturer of the module must instruct the installer about the required labeling of the host device, and we talked about that already for a couple of minutes. The module manufacturer or grantee must instruct the installer that further testing will be necessary at the final system level. And these are the spot check tests that I referenced earlier. So if you're a host manufacturer and you've installed this module into your device, regardless of whether it's a full or limited modular approval, you still are responsible for doing some spot check tests to ensure that the device continues to comply when installed in your specific host. Those spot check tests, I can tell you right now, you do not have to go to an accredited, recognized test lab to perform them. Now, there are advantages if you do go to one of those, but it's not absolutely required, and that's something that you should be aware of. So if you have the capability, for example, to do a limited amount of testing in-house, then that might be sufficient for your specific situation. Of course, you have to have confidence in the test results. Confidence to the level of if the FCC ever contacts you with complaints of interference, you must be able to confidently present those results and say, I am confident that these results demonstrate that there's no problem with our device in this situation. If you lack that level of confidence in the testing ability of the test facility you're considering using, then in that situation it might behoove you to actually seek out a test lab that has been accredited and recognized by the FCC for this particular type of testing. One other thing I will note as well is that the spot check tests that a host manufacturer must perform once they've installed a certified module into their host, those specific tests are not defined in the rules anywhere. There is a KTV publication, and we'll be talking about those in a few minutes, that offers some suggestions or guidance on how to determine what tests are appropriate for that particular device installed into your particular host. But again, it's not definite. The FCC relies upon the engineering judgment oftentimes of the manufacturer, the host manufacturer, the test lab, to make sure that they are testing everything that will be sufficient for them to have that level of confidence necessary to be able to market their device without question or concern. Just as an aside, shameless plug, but organizations like ACB, we offer engineering consulting and engineering support services. And one of the common things that we do, for example, is we will be hired by a host manufacturer to create a specific test plan based on the device, the module that they want to install in their specific host or hosts. They'd like to know, what they need to go to the test lab to have tested. We can provide that type of information. We can do that type of research for you based on the module and your particular host and all of the authorized parameters and the rules and requirements, and provide a test plan that the host manufacturer could then bring to the test lab to have the necessary testing done. So this is something, regardless of where you go to have the testing plan created, it's something that you should bring with you to the test lab. Test lab itself might be able to help you create a test plan like that, so you should inquire of the test lab as well. But these are required tests, and so it is important that this testing be performed and be performed correctly to give you, a host manufacturer, the proper confidence that you need to be able to market your device. So if you've gotten your device authorized and it's met all of the different requirements for a full modular approval, well, there it is. You got a full modular approval for your module, and you can go ahead and sell it for use under any circumstances. Now, note that this certification is optional here in North America, where only the final product must be certified. That's true. A radio module is not required to be certified. You can sell that module, an uncertified module, to a host manufacturer, and the host manufacturer can buy that uncertified module from you and install it in their device. The difference is, at that point now, that host manufacturer is responsible for certifying their host device with that radio installed. And so that means that they are going to have not a series of spot check tests, but the full range or full gamut of tests required for certification will have to be performed on that radio module as installed in your device. Technical information for that module, including schematics and things of that nature, have to be submitted with that application. That full application is reviewed by a TCB, who will then authorize you or issue to you a certification under the authorization of the FCC that allows you to put your own FCC ID number on that host with that particular radio. If you have a different host or are using a different radio module, you would have to go through that process again for that particular one as well. So radio modules do not have to be certified. They can be sold to host manufacturers in an uncertified state, but then the burden of obtaining that certification is passed along to the host manufacturer, and the host manufacturer must then jump through all of those hoops. And of course, that's exactly why buying certified modules is an attractive option for many host manufacturers. We talked about earlier, a limited modular approval is one that does not meet all 8 of the criteria that were specified before. Typically, the module grantee or the manufacturer would have a good idea of what the intended host and application is going to be for their module, especially if it's going to be a limited modular approval. That limitation might be limiting the module to particular specific application or intended use or usage configuration. It might be limiting that module to one particular host or one particular series or types of hosts, or hosts that have some certain characteristic that the module requires in order to be fully compliant. The limitation might be limited to a specific installer. Typically, that would be the grantee of the module, but it could be somebody with whom they have entered a contractual agreement that's going to be doing all of the installations. When you obtain a limited modular approval, there are potential differences in the testing that has to be performed based on what that limitation is. There are also potential differences in the certification process, again, based on what the specific limitation might be. If you are a module manufacturer and you have questions about some of these specific things that can or cannot be changed in a limited modular approval, then I would encourage you to, you can either talk to your test lab, they might have that knowledge available. If not, you can contact a TCB, and my contact information, again, is at the end of this presentation. You can contact even the FCC directly if you have specific questions. Now, it's important to remember, if you do have a limited modular approval, that it is limited. You can't, say, obtain a limited modular approval and then turn around and begin selling it to anybody under any condition, because you were not able to comply with all the requirements to be a full modular approval. And so you have to make sure, if you're the module manufacturer, if you obtained a limited modular approval for your device, that those limitations are observed when you market the device. You should not assume that a host manufacturer is going to automatically know what those limitations are and do whatever testing or take whatever steps are necessary to ensure the compliance of your module. It is the module manufacturer's responsibility to work with the host manufacturer to ensure and maintain a level of control over the installation in the case of a limited modular approval, to ensure that whatever that limitation is, it has been met in that particular host. As I said earlier, a limited module is typically authorized for use in a specific host or series of hosts that are similar or even identical in construction. If that's the case, then it is authorized for use in those hosts or series of hosts only. Doesn't mean that you can then take it and put it into any other host. The authorization is because compliance has been demonstrated only for that one particular host. Other hosts are not covered because there's no demonstration yet of compliance for use in other hosts until that testing has been performed. If you are a manufacturer of a module and are the grantee, then you can add additional hosts to your device via Class 2 permissive change. And that is certainly one of the authorization routes that a number of large module manufacturers have taken, where they have a authorization, a general mobile authorization for their particular module, and then they will work with different host manufacturers, reach a contractual agreement with them, and then the module manufacturer will then perform a Class 2 permissive change to authorize their module in the specific host of that manufacturer with whom they've reached a contractual agreement. And then that Class 2 permissive change will then permit that particular module to be used in that specific host. And this is one way that some module manufacturers do to maintain some level of control over all final installations of their device. And especially for some of the larger manufacturers, that's an important thing for them from a legal perspective. Now, when you're actually testing a device for a limited modular approval, you usually will not test it standalone on the table. It's possible to do so, but depending on what the limitation is, it then might require additional retesting on any new host because of what that specific limitation might be. So normally, to bypass that extra stage of testing, the testing is already done for a limited module in the specific host in which the module manufacturer knows the device will comply and will meet the limitations that are needed by the module in order to fully obtain compliance. Hosts that are different from one another might require separate testing. So you cannot necessarily assume that every host is the same. As a matter of fact, every host is different. Things like the location of the module with respect to the power supply in the host, or with respect to any higher power circuitry or other transmitters within the host. All of these things will affect the potential compliance of the transmitter once installed in your specific host. And so those types of changes in dissimilar hosts will typically require separate testing. When the grant is issued for the module, the grant is going to specify whether it is a full modular approval or a limited modular approval. The application, if it is limited, is going to list all of the known hosts and or installation and usage conditions that are permitted for that module. And so that information should all be available when you look at the grant for that module. Then the installation guide that's provided with it should clearly explain any and all installation and usage conditions that are required for the continuing compliance of the module installed in any specific hosts, as well as any further actions required of the host manufacturer. For example, the testing, the spot check testing that we've been talking about. So a module manufacturer is really supposed to be providing all of this information with their module when they sell it to a host manufacturer. Now, truth be told, in the real world, there are plenty of module manufacturers out there who are selling, and they might have certified modules, but they're still not selling it with all of the detailed installation information that the FCC is looking for. And, you know, it's possible that for whatever reason, the TCB that issued that grant overlooked that, misunderstood the requirement, whatever the case might be, it's out there, and there it is. And so if you are a host manufacturer, don't hesitate to ask the manufacturer of the module from whom you're buying modules to provide you with all of the details you're going to need in order to install his module into your host device so that it continues to comply once installed. That information, if it's not provided to the host manufacturer right up front with the module, is certainly something that the host manufacturer should ask the module manufacturer for. And a module manufacturer should, quote unquote, be aware of this and should be ready to provide that type of information because it really behooves all parties to ensure that the final installation is going to be compliant. And the reason it behooves both the host manufacturer and the module manufacturer equally is the fact that the FCC has clearly stated on numerous occasions that in the case of a complaint of interference, the FCC begins with the premise that the host manufacturer and the module manufacturer are equally responsible for the interference being caused. And so they begin with the premise of equal responsibility. Once they start then digging into it, they're going to be looking for things like, well, how much detail did the module manufacturer provide to the host manufacturer? And if they see that the detail is clearly lacking, then the FCC might decide that that module manufacturer is indeed more responsible for the problem and put the onus of righting the wrong, so to speak, on the module manufacturer. On the other hand, if the FCC looks into it some more and says, wow, this module manufacturer provided detailed installation instructions to the host manufacturer, but the host manufacturer ignored them and installed it in a different way, well, in that situation, the FCC is going to put the onus of compliance on the host manufacturer and really put the burden on them to fix the problem. And the third situation, which happens as well, probably equally as much as the first two, is that the module manufacturer provided adequate instructions, the host manufacturer followed those instructions, and yet there's still an issue. And in that case, the FCC would basically tell the two manufacturers, host and module, work it out amongst yourselves and resolve this issue of interference for which we've received a complaint. And so it is always in everybody, both the host and module manufacturer's best interest to make sure that all of the information is provided and followed to the best of everybody's ability. Another thing that you might see if you're a module manufacturer and you've obtained your certification for your module, or if you're a host manufacturer and you're considering buying a particular lot of modules from a manufacturer and you ask to see, or you look for their FCC certification, a lot of modules grant conditions, and again, I've mentioned before that these grants of certification will typically list whatever the limitations are and other technical criteria about the module itself for which it's been authorized. One of the requirements that you might see, especially in a lot of the older transmit or module grants, and when I say older, I'm saying like maybe in the last 3-4 years or more older, so things that have been authorized in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years or so. you'll see a lot of language on grants that says something like no co-location is permitted with other transmitters. This device may not be co-located with any other transmitter. And that's really outdated language. It's not really accurate. It's not what the FCC in the last couple of years has been asking that the TCBs actually put on the grants. We're not supposed to use that, no co-location type of language anymore. And the reason is that the real issue, the real concern for the FCC is not whether, and co-location, by the way, is defined as being within 20 centimeters, two transmitters being within 20 centimeters of each other in a single host device. The issue and the concern is not just the fact that there are two transmitters that are close together. The real issue is the fact that those two transmitters might have the capability of transmitting simultaneously. And that's the crux of the biscuit right there, that ability to simultaneously transmit is the potential concern, because that simultaneous transmission affects both EMC compliance, because intermod products, they're a real thing, people. They actually do occur, and they can be quite troublesome and problematic at times from an EMC perspective. And also from an RF exposure perspective, you've got two transmitters that's putting a lot more RF energy potentially into a human being. And so both RF exposure and EMC have special requirements for when transmitters are capable of transmitting simultaneously. And so if you have two transmitters that are co-located in a device, but you have set it up so that they cannot or are incapable of transmitting simultaneously, it's not a concern. It doesn't really matter then, because if they can't simultaneously transmit, those potential concerns that I mentioned don't arise. And so this is why that no co-location language is really kind of outdated. And the current language that the FCC actually asks that TCBs use on the grants of modules is this: the antennas used for this transmitter must not transmit simultaneously with any other antenna or transmitter except in accordance with FCC multi-transmitter product procedures. Grantees must provide installation and operating instructions for complying with FCC multi-transmitter product procedures. In other words, even if your transmitters do simultaneously transmit, that's probably going to be okay. But that particular scenario must be addressed from a compliance perspective before it begins to occur in the real world. And so it's all right if you're going to have simultaneously transmitting devices in your host device, but you have to make sure that you have addressed that possibility. And the FCC has provided guidance both for EMC and for RF exposure concerns that specifically address the situation when you do have simultaneously transmitting devices that are co-located, that are within 20 centimeters of one another. So that's one thing to be on the lookout when you're looking at the grant of certification for one of these modular devices. Another thing that you will oftentimes see on the grant requirements of a module is a reference to it being a mobile device, the keyword being mobile, or sometimes it'll say just something to the effect of must be 20 centimeters or more from a person, must be located such that all persons are at least 20 centimeters away, during normal operations, something along those lines. When you see that word mobile device or talking about a distance like that in centimeters, that's now dealing with an RF exposure issue. Now, I mentioned earlier that the majority of modules are at least initially approved as mobile devices. The mobile device, with respect to RF exposure compliance, a mobile device is a device that's going to be typically used at 20 centimeters or more from the human body. And so it might be something that sits on a desk somewhere and transmits. It might be an access point on the wall or the ceiling in your office. All of those things are mobile devices. They're not fixed. A fixed device, and we're not going to talk too much about here because most modules are not used in fixed devices. Fixed devices typically have a tower-mounted type of antenna, like for broadcast type transmission and things like that. And so we're not going to touch on that so much for modules. But mobile devices are things that can be used, but still will be used more than 20 centimeters from the body. Now, the device that's used at less than 20 centimeters from the body is called a portable device with respect to RF exposure compliance. And there are different testing and RF exposure requirements for portable devices versus mobile devices. A mobile device, which is used 20 centimeters or more from the body, is subject to maximum permissible exposure, MPE limits, which is really a measure of power density at a specific distance. For portable devices used less than 20 centimeters from the body, those limitations are in terms of specific absorption rate, SAR, and this is the actual energy absorbed by human tissue, and it's limited to a certain amount of watts per kilogram of human tissue. And that's what SAR testing is performed for portable devices. Most devices, most modules, as I said, are typically, at least initially, approved as mobile devices. And then if there is a specific host that somebody wishes to use that module in, that host might be used closer than 20 centimeters from the body, well, then you can perform, the module manufacturer can perform a Class 2 permissive change and for their module to be used in that specific host in a portable configuration. And then additional things will have to be addressed at that point. So the limited modular approval, getting back to the grant limitations here, as I said earlier, is going to be listing whatever those limitations are in its grant remarks on the grant of authorization. So, for example, if the criteria that the module did not meet was it didn't have its own shield over its RF circuitry, so it had to be a limited modular approval for that reason, then typically that means that the module manufacturer is going to have to control that installation into host devices that it knows will provide both the necessary shielding to keep the spurious emissions down, and also will not be putting the module in a position where it's going to be negatively influenced by the fields that occur within the host. And so the grant is typically going to limit that host to a specific type of device in order to ensure that that's the case. Another example is if the module does not have its own power supply regulation, and as a result had to get a limited modular approval, then usually, again, the grant is going to say something like, this device is authorized for installation into host devices under the control of the grantee. And so, again, that level of control must be placed on the grantee here to ensure that the host devices are going to provide power supply, voltage levels and current levels to the module that do not drive the module into some state of noncompliance. So remember that a certified transmitter, which is what this module has become, certification is a term that indicates not only technical compliance, in other words, it's passed certain tests, but it also implies legal compliance. This is a legally traceable reference to the module and can be used in courts and by lawyers and the whole nine yards. So it's not simply about just a lot of testing that's performed, but it becomes a legal document as well. And recall, again, these are reminders that just because a module has been certified, it does not guarantee that every host device into which it's installed is going to necessarily comply. And that's why those spot check tests are required. Similarly, it does not mean that the host device is now somehow certified just because it has a certified module placed in it. That host device is still not certified. It simply includes or contains a certified module. Are we doing on time? Okay, we're doing all right. So I have a link here. I've been referencing some of the FCC policies with respect to modular approvals. A lot of these policies, or all of these policies really for the most part, can be found in this one particular publication, KDB, which by the way stands for Knowledge Database Publication. These are publications that the FCC puts out that contain policies and procedures used to fully explain the requirements and the rules, and to also explain how compliance with those requirements has to be shown for different types of devices. FCC rules, because of the laws in the United States, an FCC rule typically takes 1 to 3 years to be changed or for a new rule to be added. It can be a very lengthy process. There's a lot of periods of time when it has to be put out for public comment and public reply comment, things like that. It's a very open process, but it can take a very long time. It certainly moves a lot more slowly than technology. And so the FCC developed these knowledge database publications. These provide policies and procedures. These are not typically set in stone as the rules are, do not typically carry the same weight as rules, but almost. In other words, if you're not compliant with what it says to do in a KDB, even if the rule is a little bit ambiguous on a particular matter, if the KDB is not, and you're not compliant with it, then you can't get a grant. Your device is not going to be able to be certified. And so the KDBs are very important. There's a link here where you can go to the FCC website and search on the KDBs based on either their reference number or some various keywords that might be used. The primary module publication, as I mentioned earlier, 996369, is actually, when you go to that link, it's composed of 4 different documents, DO1 through DO4. DO1 is the overall guidance, and a lot of the presentation that I've been giving you today is taken from DO1 as well as the rules. DO1 makes a lot of reference to 15.212 as well. DO2 is a series of questions and answers, a Q&A, that actually is very helpful and really covers a lot of different potential situations the FCC has been asked about over the years, and they've provided their responses to a lot of these common questions that come up. So that's a very useful document there. DO3 and DO4 are more recent documents that have just been issued a little over a year now, maybe somewhere in between 1 and 2 years at this point. I can't remember the exact date. But these documents came out, and DO3 is especially aimed both at the module manufacturers, the module grantees, and also the TCBs, to give them information that they need to look for, particularly with respect to the details regarding the installations. That was really the big point that the FCC wanted to make in DO3 was this is where we're defining the level of detail we expect the module manufacturer to provide to the host manufacturer regarding how to install their module into their host device. DO4, the Module Integration Guide, actually came about from a committee that was formed by the TCB Council. I'm on the board of directors for that, and I'm also on that particular committee. And we worked up DO4 and presented it to the FCC, who then made a few tweaks to it and issued it as their DO4. And this was something that we wanted to provide specifically to host manufacturers. And in here, we give some general guidance on what type of spot checks must be performed, what the level of your requirements are when you're installing a certified module into your host device, labeling, information to the user, things of that nature. And so I highly recommend if you're at all involved in modules, whether you're a module manufacturer, a host manufacturer, or a test lab who tests them, if you're not already familiar with these 4 documents under 996369, I highly recommend that you do so because there's a wealth of information contained in there. I list here a few other KTV publications that include relevant information for modules, 784748 labeling requirements, and as I recall, that also has user information requirements in that as well. I should probably add that to the slide. 447498 is the main RF exposure requirements. It talks a lot about modules and things like that in there for RF exposure. Then 616217 is specific SAR guidance for a lot of module hosts, at least laptops and tablets. So these are all very useful publications. When it comes to RF exposure, of course, as I've been saying, most modules are certified as mobile devices operated for use at distances of 20 centimeters or greater. When it comes to doing that MPE assessment for most lower power devices below several watts or more, it's just a matter of doing the math. It's mathematical calculations of power density at particular distances. When you do get to higher power levels, then there's a requirement that MPE, those power densities, actually be measured with electric field probes, typically at specific distances. The installers then must be made aware, if this is a mobile device, of this 20-centimeter minimum separation distance required between the module and all persons during normal operation of the host. And they must be made aware of the fact that they must then inform the end users of this requirement as well, maintaining that minimum separation distance. Certifying a module as a portable device, as I mentioned earlier, it can be done initially, but usually, excuse me, it's only done through Class 2 permissive changes to mobile devices. But if you do decide to try and get a portable approval for your module, if it's a very, very low power module, it might meet the SAR test exclusion threshold for portable devices. I reference where that is here in 447498. And if that's the case, and we're talking typically about like a milliwatt or less, you could get that type of module approved for portable devices, which means it can be used closer to the body or further away. It doesn't matter. But if it does not meet that SAR test exclusion, then typically there's going to be SAR testing performed, and usually that SAR testing will be performed on the specific host in which it's going to be used, because SAR is usually very host specific. It is possible to get SAR testing done on a module. It's not common, and to be honest with you, I would be hesitant to even recommend it, because many times it proves to not be useful, and SAR testing can be extremely expensive, you know, starting at 10,000, 10K kind of thing. And so you certainly don't want to be doing a lot of testing if it's not going to be useful to you. So I would hesitate before doing SAR testing on a naked module like that. Certainly that's something, if you have questions about that, that can be discussed in detail for your particular situation. And that's what I'm talking about here. If you do get portable approval, excuse me, for your module, then the SAR level that you measure from it is going to specify the level of freedom that module has, so to speak, to be used in portable configurations. If it's a very low SAR level, less than 0.4 watts per kilogram, can be used in any host, and it ranges up from there. All of this is in that KDB I referenced previously, 447498. So that's where you can go back and look for all this information. And again, I talked earlier, if you've gotten your module approved as a mobile device, but want to use it in a specific portable host, you can do that as a Class 2 change unless, again, the module is so low power that it meets the SAR test exclusion threshold. Very low power, as I said, you know, a milliwatt or two at the most, typically for most frequency bands. So if you are able to meet that, then it's automatically good to go in a portable host as well. But in any event, the module manufacturer is going to have to apply a Class 2 permissive change, even if SAR testing is not required, because they have to report the fact, and it has to become publicly available on the FCC website, that their module has been approved for portable usage in that particular host. So the Class 2 permissive change is required even if the SAR testing is not required. And if the host device uses any of these specialized types of proximity, gravity, or motion sensors, or some of the other things that they use to do time averaging for SAR compliance, those are all special cases that are going to require individual SAR tests. I highly recommend that you contact a TCB or the FCC itself to work out a test plan for that before you go and potentially spend a whole lot of money that testing things that maybe are not going to be helpful for you. It used to be that if you were adding a module to a device, you always had to file the Class 2 permissive change for it. That's no longer the case. If you put a mobile module into a device and the device stays mobile, even if you've added other transmitters to it, you no longer have to file the Class 2 change for the module, as long as its RF exposure configuration, mobile in this case, does not change. I'm speeding up here because I see that we're running out of time. Just got a couple of slides here about Canada. Again, the vast majority of the Canadian requirements for modules are very, very similar to the FCC's. RSP 100 has Section 8 lists their various requirements, and RSS Gen Section 4.3 has their labeling requirements. Similar for the host, the module, the host has to bear a label that shows contains TXFCC or IC in this case, colon, and the IC ID number of that particular module. When it comes to electronic labeling, just as an aside, for a module, the FCC will allow electronic labeling only if the module itself has some type of view screen, which typically is not the case, or if it's dedicated to a specific host that has a view screen that will show that can show the electronic label. ISAID just says if it has to be used with any kind of dedicated host, it doesn't have to specify quite so much, but as long as any type of dedicated host has a screen, then you can use the electronic labeling option for ISAID. Again, their technical criteria in Canada are very similar to the FCC's, but they're not identical. You have to submit a separate form that's available as on the ISAID website in RSP 100 Annex D. Again, you can't just use the FCC form for 15212. ISAID does require specific use of their own forms showing compliance with their specific requirements. One thing that ISAID does do is they right up front say that licensed and unlicensed transmitters follow these same sets of rules for modules. The FCC, as I mentioned earlier, the licensed transmitters follow most of the rules, but it's more by policy than by rule that occurs. ISAID is a little bit more clear in their rules themselves when it comes to the licensed devices. ISAID also has a requirement where if a specific host is required for the module to comply, and it's a limited modular approval for a specific host, they also require that the module identify that host with the HMN, the host model number or marketing name. And I don't remember off the top of my head if it's marketing name or model number, but in either event, if the host is required for the module to comply, then the module manufacturer must provide this HMN, must identify what that host is to ISAID, and that identified host will also be listed on the REL, the radio equipment list by ISAID, along with the module. And that pretty much finishes it up. I'm sorry I went to go a couple of minutes over at this point, but Kim, I don't know if there are any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions now, or people can email them to me as well.
Greg, I saw a couple of questions come in if you want to go ahead and respond to those.
Sure. I'm going to stop sharing.
All right.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and just read them to me, I'll see if I can answer them.
All right. So we have a question that came in, and the question is, I know this webinar is about U.S. requirements, but how global are modular approvals? For instance, if I have a global product, not just the U.S. and Canada, how helpful is an approved module? Is there a list or countries that accept module approvals?
That's a very good question. And to be honest with you, for example, the EU does not recognize modular approvals. The EU has a very different approach, and I believe that that's going to be covered in a future webinar. As a matter of fact, it is going to be EU approvals, including approvals for modules, quote unquote, because they, you know, spoiler alert, they don't have modules under the RED. The RED does not recognize radio modules. And so, to be honest with you, and much of the world relies on various ETSI type requirements that are written for the RED and for other European type of stuff, where again, modules are not recognized as a thing. People know that they exist, but they do not have, they do not carry any type of legal weight. They do not provide any true benefit as they do here in North America. And so to a great extent, North America, kind of, when it comes at least to the major economies around the world, North America is really the primary place where this modular approval does work. Now, I really, to be honest with you, I can't address a lot of the smaller economies with whom the FCC, or the United States, I should say, does not have an MRA. And I'm not that familiar with some of those smaller economies and stuff, but I know that at least of North America and Europe and a lot of Asia, they don't necessarily recognize modules the way we do here in North America. And so a modular approval will get you a long way in North America, will not get you nearly as far in Europe. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Next question is it possible to ship modules as prototypes to North America, or do they have to go through the whole approval process before? And are there any exceptions?
Okay, so I guess what it really comes down to is I'm presuming that eventually you want to get these modules authorized and certified and sold. And if that's the case, I mean, if you're just selling them as sub-assemblies that are not certified and that somebody else is going to have to take, install on their device, and then certify their device, then there's no limitation. These are sub-assemblies that are not final products, and you're permitted to import them. If you want them to become modules, and to be honest with you, don't take what I'm about. Don't bet the farm on this. I would certainly recommend that if you want to contact me or send me an email, I can research this a little bit further. But if you're not marking it as a module and you want to import components, for example, into the United States, I don't think that there's a problem with that. It's really when you begin to sell it. Then are you going to be selling it as a certified module? In other words, you might import the modules here into the United States and then authorize them once they're here. But once they're authorized, further shipments are going to have to bear that FCC ID number. And I can confirm that if I'm not 1,000% sure of that. I'm pretty sure that that's the case. But once that authorization is in place and that certification has been issued, at that point, when those modules are coming in, they have to be labeled as certified modules in order for them to get through customs. And I believe that's my understanding of the way the requirement is currently at customs is once it's been approved, then it should be labeled properly, and they're going to be looking for that at customs. So.
All right, and last question. Are USB dongles for laptops considered modular approved products?
Very good question. USB dongles are a specific subset of modules, and in many ways they are similar to modules, but FCC actually has their own separate specific guidance for USB dongles as well. And so while in a lot of ways they are modular-like, they're like a module in a lot of ways, in other ways they're not. And so it really kind of depends on what you're looking for. In other words, I mean, if you're selling a USB module that's got a radio on it, then it is what it is. I mean, people know that they're going to have a USB port in order to use your device and plug it in. So you're going to have your device approved as a radio and most likely as a computer peripheral also. So that's a given one way or the other. And so really in the end, there's no advantage, I don't think, to authorizing a USB dongle transmitter as a module because in a lot of ways, as I said, it already is like a module. It can be plugged into different things. And the FCC has separate rules that say if you take an authorized device and completely enclose it in another device, even if that authorized device is not authorized as a module, the host manufacturer is still required to put the ID of that device on the outside of the host. So if you take a USB stick that's got a transmitter in it, okay, like a wireless, a hotspot or something like that, all right, and it's certified, okay, and you put that into your host device and you've completely enclosed it inside your host device so that the user cannot see that USB dongle. At that point, the FCC says you as the host manufacturer are required to put a label on the outside of your device that says this device contains TX FCC ID XYZ, even though it's not a module because you've taken it and completely enclosed it where the user cannot see the ID. And the reason for all this in the end is the FCC always wants to ensure that the end user has access to seeing what the ID number is. Because if there's ever an interference complaint or anything like that, that's the information that the FCC is first going to ask them is, do you know what the FCC ID number is of this radio? And so the whole point of all this is to always ensure that the end user can see the ID number. So if the dongle is sticking out the side of a laptop, well then sure, you don't have to put anything on the laptop that says this contains, because the user can just sit and look at the dongle sticking out of the laptop and see the ID number on the dongle. But if you're embedding a dongle inside another device so that no one is ever going to see it, then in that case, you have to make that dongle's ID available to everybody by listing it on the outside of your device and saying this device contains. So I hope that helps.
Well, thank you, Greg, for going ahead and answering some questions for us today. If we did not get to your question, or if you have questions after this webinar, please feel free to send your questions to questions@wll.com or the email that Greg did provide early on, and I will also make sure that Greg receives it. Our thanks goes to Greg Schumack for taking time out to enlighten us about wireless modular certification for North America, IoT, and other applications. Our next upcoming webinar is covering automated visual inspection with measurements using Roden Swartz Advise software presented by Roden Swartz, actually a week from today, June 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you haven't already done so, make sure you visit our website to register for this webinar if you're interested. On behalf of the Washington Labs Academy, I would like to thank you all for attending. I'm going to go ahead and now end the event. Please enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe. Thanks again, Greg.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.